Well, hello everybody. This is a look at libertarianism, or a look at a stateless society which is based on a different view of who we are as individuals. And that's the nature part. The freedom, it's nature, who we are as individuals, and its cause, where we get the attitude of individual respect from our parents, and how that is actually more important than law in society, and how the affluence and happiness of society is based entirely on the fact that only the individual is competent to make decisions for herself. And that's the only source of society, the only result, the decent result of society. And so the nature of society is that the nature of the world, freedom's nature, is based on the fact that the world does not exist until we learn language. In the beginning is the Word. Now, from God's perspective, if you're a theist, then that's the complete Word and the complete creation, the complete reality, the complete objective reality. And as we become lesser beings, like St. Francis or Einstein or Mother Teresa or Bill Mollison, the founder of permaculture, who are all big thinkers, holistic thinkers, we become less we will become aware of a smaller world. Our reality becomes smaller. No scientist can comprehend what God can comprehend. And these normal people, these normal levels of development of the individual, all the way down to the infant, become less and less competent with language and less competent with creating a reality. In fact, I would say that the only thing left for this infant is pure subjective experience, since there's no way to say that you have a world, because a world is something you can describe. It's not something you can simply observe as a subjective experience. Observation, the word observation itself means to describe in the classical use of the term. So, what is freedom's nature in terms, so that's why I come to the conclusion that objectivity does not exist except as intersubjective agreement, as my psychology professor told me when I was taking research methods, that for scientists, research psychologists, objectivity is nothing but intersubjective agreement. It doesn't exist on its own. And look at all these scientists, look at all their different perspectives. They have intersubjective agreement when they write things, and it's mostly a subjective, almost a priori. In the case of economics, it is a priori. It's almost an a priori discovery of the world for them. Of course, these people all have reference to the empirical research, like Einstein here. But it's a mental process. It's a subjective creativity. Moreover, that subjectivity is by nature completely private. Therefore, all objectivity, objective knowledge, must be voluntarily determined. Because if you create, along with other people, the objectivity or the objective world, and I just don't see that the objective world is anything other than what you've created, then how can you be told what is real unless you accept it, right? It's up to you to decide whether something is true or not. because that's up to your consciousness. It's up to your your subjectivity, which no one else knows about. They have nothing to say about. No one has anything to say about anyone else's subjectivity, except, God, because his subjectivity is yours. But I'm not talking about theism here. So plus authority, I'm just talking about a hierarchy of awarenesses. Plus authority must have objectivity, right? In order for anything to be an authority, it must have objectivity to it. Right? Authority must have objective knowledge. You don't refer to somebody as an authority unless you assume that there's some objective knowledge behind his authority. And if you're not also the authority, you assume in that area, you assume he knows something. So, and yet the whole thing comes from subjectivity, this unknown element. So out of that, we can only conclude that all authority is either voluntary or it's false. And so, for instance, if you hire a plumber, that's a legitimate authority. You've decided he's legit based on word of mouth or by your own experience with him. Okay? Whereas a coercive authority, like Lincoln, was false. And government itself, being involuntary, it's illegitimate because this woman decides is the only person who can decide, who's competent to decide about what she thinks is true, because she's the only one who has to live with it. You can't tell her how to live. You might make suggestions based on your own experience, but her subjective nature is what creates the objective world. And our parents respect that. Our parents focus on making us happy, and they do so by serving our individuality, our subjectivity, even though they don't know what it is, but they have this affinity for us, this natural affinity. And this love and respect goes out to everyone else in society as we grow up. That's where it comes from, and that's what makes a great society, having great parents. And respect for the individual is opposite of government. The government does not respect the individual. It's an involuntary institution. Therefore, parental love is the source of anarchy. And by the way, most of our lives are anarchistic. Okay? Almost everything we do is anarchistic. Now, what are the mechanics of freedom? How does it operate? How does freedom operate? In a voluntary society, every producer must please the consumer as compared to every other producer. That's logically follows, right, from the fact that you own yourself, that you're free. Producers, therefore, constantly improve and innovate in their output, including their wage offerings. For instance, Henry Ford gives $10 million in his 1914 profits to his employees. In fact, Henry Ford raised wages, he doubled wages for factory workers, and he lowered work hours from 9 hours to 8 hours. That was in his self-interest, by the way. He may have been altruistic, but the altruism always comes from his own interest. All altruism is self-interest. And now, the producers of law, security, and defense are also subject to these laws of voluntarism, those laws of self-ownership. Without it, there's no competition, there's only corruption. It is a corrupt concept to not have competition in the delivery of any service. Because if you have no choice, even the person who is saintly cannot deliver because he doesn't know whether you're pleased or not. He has no way of knowing. He has to have a feedback mechanism of consent or lack of consent, or participation or lack of participation. Now, if you're worried about these security agencies taking over in a free society without government, they wouldn't do that because peace is cheaper than war. And these security companies would tend to preempt conflict with each other by conflict resolution agreements, as insurance companies do now. There's more profit in peace than there is in war, unless you're a monopoly government. So conflict is so expensive, any attempted hegemony by any of the security competitors would tend to be squashed by the rest of the competitors and the free public. And by the way, if I'm wrong about this, we already have a dominant monopoly controlling society. Let's see here, I got a little problem here with the, well, I can scroll over this way. So, let me read this. Since conflict is so expensive, okay, so, for example, of the expensiveness of conflict, hegemony just doesn't come about, is that the Somalia clans have defeated foreign armies since 1991 that were sent in. They were sent in to uphold provisional monopoly government in Mogadishu. And yet they were defeated. They were defeated by, so I'm not only demonstrating that there's a tendency not to have hegemony in a free society. Free society can defend itself against monopoly society. So it shows that it's even stronger. I mean, they came in and they beat the hell out of the Americans when they came in. That's what Black Hawk Down was all about, that movie. They came in and they beat the UN forces, and then they beat the Somali forces out, and then not Somali, the Ethiopian forces, and then they beat out the African National Congress forces. And look at the Afghanis. Their coalitions defeated the Soviets, right? This is basically an anarchistic outfit. And then look at another organization. When the gold miners in California were there, they did their own dispute claims, and they did it peacefully. It was very acceptable to them because it was their own people, their own companions. Most of those mines, by the way, were done. Most of that mining, by the day, was done by 4 or 5 people because they had to use machines after the initial starts of it. They weren't able to do it alone, and so they created machines after a while. I was reading about it. So another aspect of the mechanics of freedom is that since law is inherent in freedom, right? If you're free, that means there's law protecting you. But freedom predominantly comes from the love and respect for the individual that you learned from our parents. If that respect doesn't predominate society, well, law will not work. So that's really the nature. This really should say the nature, freedom's nature. I really should change this back to freedom's nature. Therefore, legal systems are a last resort of society. Now, I'm going to change this back to the other color and call it freedom's nature. Now, here's some more mechanics here. It's a diagram. I'll just put it like that so you can focus easily on it. You see, this diagram is a diagram illustrating the individual, or not just the individual, but individual as he creates society from his subjectivity, from that level of unmanifest mind. And this column here is a schematic way of looking at reality, the reality of the individual, the collective, the objective individual, the subjective individual. And that subjective individual is the unmanifest mind we experience. See, we experience this column here. We experience the tenderness and energy and commitment and devotion and love that a family has. This picture's too small. This is a picture of people getting together and networking. That's a reality that we experience. These realities are schematics of those realities, right? I mean, these schematics, these are just schematics of those realities, images representing schematics of those realities. But we know we have these experiences, this experience, and then we create a new subjective reality, plus the objective reality, but there's not enough room on this chart. And that is something we reflect on. We go back and forth between our quiet self and our more active self, the self that was produced by this networking. And then we reflect on it and we restructure it constantly and restructure the human networking, and the objective individual gets restructured. And the human networking gets restructured. And he creates these new things get created. A whole reflection of these three things get created out here, and another three things. So it's just an ongoing process of self-determination, which creates that's what the source of society is. So now let me conclude with my proof. It's quite a long proof, but it includes all these elements that I've just spoken of. It's a 13-step proof that government shouldn't exist. The only important goal of life is the happiness of the individual. So the self, the small self, this should be, I should make that small self, right? The small self. I don't like to focus on the big self because it's a distraction. Now, the summary proof. Okay, and then, step 2. Only this important goal of life is the happiness. Only the individual can competently decide for herself. Only the individual knows how her decisions affected herself. Intellectuals and bureaucrats don't know. We are against slavery, precisely because no one can be happy when being told what to do. Where's my, I don't have a picture for that. Oh, only the autonomous individual is competent to make decisions for herself. Summary proof. Now, step 3. When deciding for ourselves, we can live as we like and keep what we acquire through trade or work. As free people, we would enforce or hire enforcement of those private property rights. Freedom, therefore, presupposes law. Private property forms society, in other words. In short, okay. Now, let's put this over here. Now, here's the mechanics. It's more mechanics. The social advantage of freedom is the mechanics of freedom. The social advantage of freedom is feedback from receivers to suppliers. Everyone is both. By giving or withholding value to the suppliers, all the receivers tell the suppliers what the receivers want. It tells the suppliers to constantly adjust what they supply, including new offerings, to the changing preferences of the receivers. This process maximizes the happiness of everyone. All value in life is created in this way, voluntarily and therefore competently. So, the omnicompetence of freedom maximizes social well-being. Step 5. Pollution and environmental degradation is a violation of the law, i.e. a restriction on freedom. Since the government has been in charge of law, the government has failed to protect us from pollution. In fact, government has been the greatest polluter by far. So the point of this one is all human issues are private property issues. The government is not interested in private property. Okay, let's get past this. A society without government would have the least pollution and environmental degradation because free and lawful individuals and businesses would anticipate legal liability and insurance liability, just as businesses and insurance companies do now when not shielded and diverted by government. They do so because they would not have the immunity of government and grants of immunity by government. Like law, like other businesses, requires competition. Only through competition can all functions of society be carried out. So, the point being, all functions of society delivered through the mechanics of freedom. Okay, step 7. Government is a monopoly. Monopolies get no feedback from receivers except through political approval, a feedback mechanism suitable for maintaining political power. Government is more than a monopoly. It is a compulsive monopoly. Actually, all monopolies are compulsive monopolies. Everyone but special interests has to contribute to and participate in its operations, right? Everyone but the special interests. So this is government's monopolistic nature. Government hasn't the feedback mechanism of freedom because it takes by force and doesn't get any individual feedback. It has no balance sheet of what people like except in its political feedback. So monopoly government has only political feedback. I wanted to make that pretty clear. All monopolies are violent organizations. John D. Rockefeller did not have a monopoly because anyone could compete with him. In fact, the price and quality of kerosene improved throughout the heyday of his company. At this time of laissez-faire, Americans' real wages increased perhaps more than in any country in history. So monopolies cannot form in free markets. I had a guy tell me on campus here that Rockefeller used violence to acquire his refineries. I mean, what kind of world is this guy living in, you know? Since when have governments not crushed private companies, even big ones? Government simply takes and redistributes according to its political pressures. Its redistributions pay off political contributors and large constituencies. Those two groups utilize the giant protection racket that violent monopoly government is. It is therefore lawless. Government equals special privileges equals lawlessness. It always does by definition. Summing it all up. Love leads to respect for the individual, which leads to private property rights, which equals the lawful feedback of voluntarism, which equals society and competition, which leads to happiness and prosperity. This is not equal to monopoly government, which is the initiation of violence, special privileges, and lawlessness, which leads to the decay of society. Thus, government does nothing for the individual. Therefore, government ought to be abolished. So, to me, I don't see any way, given the nature of subjectivity. The nature of subjectivity, let's see, where is that? Here it is. No, here. Yeah, given the nature of subjectivity and the nature of objectivity and the nature of authority, how this is possible for anything to be created that is not destructive of even more if you create force and you force the individual. I don't understand how that's possible. If you can explain that to me, I'd like to know it. Thank you very much. How do you shut this off? Oh, here.